So we kick off the lead part with a series of open position chords, the first one of which is this E7 sharp 9 chord. You're probably more familiar with that one in this position here, rooted off the A string. You know, the good old Hendrix chord. If we play it in this position, you can simply visualize an open E and then a little finger barring strings B and E at the 3rd fret. Bring it all together and you have this. Now I do it slightly differently. Instead of using 2 fingers to fret the A and D strings, I use the 2nd finger to bar them both with the tip of the finger. And again, this is one of those techniques I've spoken about in depth before, but essentially aim for the wood in between the 2 strings and it'll take a lot of practice. You'll have a lot of buzzing notes and bad sounding chords for a while, but eventually you'll get used to doing that. And it frees up an extra digit, which is always useful. So we hit that chord and let it ring out for 2 bars. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we play an A13. Just visualize a good old open A7 chord and bring the 13 or the 6th in on the top string. And then we go back to another E7 type of chord. This is an interesting one. It's an E7 first and foremost. So there's your root. Here's your flattened 5th, the root again, sharp 9, flat 7, and another sharp 9. And then we go back to the A13, but the note on the D string goes down a semitone. So we have an A13 with a flattened 5th in there. And that's the end of the intro. As always, you can get the thorough typed up lesson materials in tab and notation, Guitar Pro and PDF formats, as well as my backing track, at the links in the description. I do have a Patreon where for the price of a couple of cups of coffee per month, you get access to absolutely all of my lesson materials and a ton of bonus stuff. Or if it's just this lesson you're interested in, you can buy it as a one-off purchase at the Gumroad link. Now we're into the head of the tune. We're going to start with the first A section. So we started with an octave of B notes, and then we're thinking E major. We're playing the major 3rd and climbing the E major scale. And then as the chord shifts from the E major to the E minor via that dropping of the 3rd, we mirror that movement on the melody. Minor 3rd. But the other notes are still the same. Then we play this. That phrase began over what would be the A13, which really we're just thinking A7 to simplify. There's the flat 7. And then moving into the D chord, you can see how here we're ending up in a D major triad, just the third and the fifth, and we're doing this little side step into it. We then follow that down to the C chord, just as the rhythm part moves down to this C9. Then on the B9, again you can be visualizing a B major triad there to lock everything in. Starting on the sharpened fifth, you've got the sus4, third, fifth root. And then we're round to the second A section with this little typical pickup line. Nice little bit of enclosure around this B note. Notice how I'm using a lot of rest strokes again. Very similar to the first A section. Go to the minor, but then this time, one of those typical Django bends. We're thinking about the note we want to play, 12th fret, simply come down a semitone and bend up to it via a half step bend. Make it quite a lazy bend. It sounds more emotive if you don't quite make the half step. Let it arc back down a little bit. Very similar to before, but then this really nice little sign-off phrase. This is something I heard in Dorado Schmitt's version of this tune. Again, we're thinking B7. You can visualize the B major triad again as a landmark. And then one of those Django bends again. We're headed for this note here, the 11th fret of the G string. So we go to the 10th fret and give it a steep half step bend downwards. Let it arc back. And then decorate this root note of the resolving E major chord. Root, second root with a trill. Now heading to the B section, we do a little bit of enclosure around that E note. And then, thinking A minor, we grab the top two notes of an A minor triad. So we've got the flat 3 and the 5. And then we continue on playing double stops on the top two strings. These are all taken from a G major scale. And then we go a semitone down before returning back to the G major there. Just following the chord change really from the G diminished back to the G major 6. Because if you think about this G major triad here, top two notes, the third and the fifth, drop them a semitone and they become part of a G diminished triad, the flat 3 and the flat 5. So they're perfectly mirroring that chord. And then over this climbing diminished change that resolves back to the A minor, we play this. Again, all very much taken from the triads that would match those chords. And then over the C9, we're going to play this. All on the B string, frets 10, 12 and 13. Again, adding a lot of that typical Gypsy ornamentation, trills and semitone enclosure around that B note. Then on the B7, where it stops, we've interjected with a very simple but common kind of Gypsy idea. We're thinking B7, first and foremost, here's your arpeggio. Now we can add the flat 9 to that. B7 flat 9, one of those very typical sounds in jazz, especially Gypsy jazz, where on a dominant chord you're almost defaulting at times to adding a flat 9 in there. It's a great sound. And the idea here is to give you something that's really easy to digest and work on. You know, these simple little improvised fills don't really require much more than a basic knowledge of your arpeggios and an ability to be able to add things like a flat 9 off the cuff. And it's always easy to find the flat 9 because you can be certain it's always a semitone above the root. So here's our exact phrase. We trill between the root and the flat 9, and then descend our B7 arpeggio, and then grab the flat 9 again before stopping on the root. Notice again how rest stroke picking, but also abiding by one of those gypsy rules of picking, which is to start every new string on a downstroke. I'm not as religious about that as some people are, but I do like to do it sometimes if I really want to push the front end of those notes. Now on to the final A section, very much like the second A section. We're just filling in that space this time rather than leaving it on a hanging note. Then again we do the bendy phrase, minor third, double stops. In fact, this time we did it a little differently, didn't we? We went... So we're still targeting the D chord here, but we're going from a semitone below, then a whole tone above before landing it. Then this bit's the same as before. And then that beautiful Dorado Schmitt phrase again. And that ends the head of the tune. Now for our improvised outro, again, I've tried to come up with phrases that really outline simple and important concepts within this style. So remember here that we're dealing with this harmonic groundwork of a 1 going to a 4 minor. So E major to A minor. That's going to go back and forth, and we're going to play phrases that outline those changes. So we come in over the A minor, we're going to play, and then resolve onto the E major there. So if we're thinking A minor, we're playing root 2 flat 3, which is one of those really common gypsy ideas that I've spoken about at length in the Mark Rebo videos I've done in fact as well. Nothing but an A minor triad with the 2 added before the flat 3 every time. Root 2 flat 3 5. Root 2 flat 3 5. Amazing how pretty that sounds. So our phrase begins with that, but then we bring in the flat 7, thinking A minor 7. Then slide up to what would be the 9, thinking A minor 9. And then a little chromatic descending run down to the major third of the E chord that has now landed. And then grab the root of the E chord. Now for our second phrase, let's break it down into the 2 chords that it covers. First off, the A minor section. A minor 6 arpeggio, 6, 5, flat 3, root, 6, 5, flat 3, root, 6, 5, flat 3, root. You can get a lot out of that group of notes. A little bit of a chromatic run up from the 5th to the 6th. And then one of those trills again. Then coming down to the 6th and bouncing back to the root. And then we're thinking about the next chord, E major. So we're looking for the major third and we're going to walk up chromatically to that. And then the 5th, back to the 3rd, the 7th, and the 6th. Decorating it with the sound of major 7th, major 6th, that kind of a thing. Let's do the same for the next phrase. Let's break it down into the chord by chord approach. So if we start on the A minor, we're going to do one of those Django bends. We're thinking of the 6th, but we're starting a semitone below and bending a half step to it. And then trilling from the 5th to the 6th and back before coming down an A minor triad and then climbing back up. Really, you can just be visualizing an A minor chord here. Django used to use this a lot. So we're just climbing through that group of notes. And then resolving to the 3rd of E again, just as that chord arrives. And then we're going to play a nice little octave on the 5th of the chord again, the B note. And the next phrase. This is something I picked up from Bireli Lagrene, one of the great modern gypsy players, thinking A minor 6 again. Notice how a lot of the time here we're thinking A minor 6. The 6th is such a great note to be adding into your phrases. Now for the first part of that phrase, don't visualize anything more complicated than an A minor triad, or arpeggio. 5, flat 3, 1, 5, flat 3. Start on the 5 here, and then go up to the octave higher. Get used to that. Now we embellish that first note with a very typical Gypsy concept, this idea of note enclosure, which I'm going to do a full lesson on, but just to give it a quick summary here, you take a note that's a target note, in that case the fifth of your A minor arpeggio. You can approach it from a semitone below or a scale tone above. In this case we're thinking A melodic minor, so there's your scale tone above the target note, and there's the semitone below, by which point we've enclosed the note with two surrounding notes. And we're going to play a little pull off from 9 to 11, then step back to the semitone below, and then come down the A minor arpeggio. Beautiful line. Very similar to a phrase from Django's minor swing solo. So back to our phrase. Then we go to the flat 7 and trill, end up on the 6th. Again, that minor 6th sound, beautiful. And then just come down that minor 6 arpeggio and then resolve to the root and third of the E major. So you've got A minor, E. For this next phrase I took inspiration from Stefan Rembel, one of my favourite modern Gypsy players. He's got a song called Big Brother, which many years ago I transcribed, and there's this great phrase in the solo. So it starts off with that A minor thing again, the root 2 flat 3, but really we're just ascending an A melodic minor scale, literally just climbing the scale, and adding one thing: chromaticism between the last two notes. And then we've added this on the end of it. We're coming down an A minor triad and then resolving onto the E again. Same as before, the root and the third together as a double stop. And we're going to climb through this series of double stops that outline the E major triad. This is something that will seem very familiar for you if you've seen my videos on American soul or Motown playing. We do that same trick there. Climbing through triads using double stops. Really good thing to work on. In this case we're just doing this run and we're adding a note in along the way. Root 2, 3, 5. Just like that arpeggio we spoke about earlier. Root 2, 3, 5. And then we change one note here to make this land beautifully on the A minor. So you're thinking E major to A minor. That's part of your A minor triad. And then we climb up to the next position of our A minor triad, break it down into double stops, add the 6th again, yet again that beautiful minor 6th sound, and then finish on two notes from an E major, again triad, thinking the 5th and the 3rd, and then we put in the 6th as a sweet little finishing note. And that concludes our improvised outro section. So in summary for those phrases there, the important elements to work on would be arpeggios and triads as always, but also having the ability to add in notes like the 6th on demand, or the flat 9 on a dominant chord. Those two elements alone can get you quite a way into sounding more authentically Gypsy. Now if you've made it this far into the video, I'm sure you realise how much of this is down to technique and practice, especially as far as that picking hand goes. If you want that authentic Gypsy sound, you're going to have to work for it. But with that said, let's talk about gear for a moment. I'm borrowing this beautiful guitar off a student of mine. This is exactly like a guitar I had years ago, which I sadly had to sell to raise money to build a house. But you know, now that house is built and that project's done, maybe I'll have to buy another one of these. This is a John Livois guitar, a UK-based luthier who specialises in making gypsy jazz guitars, and he's based literally an hour away from me in Lincolnshire. So I'm going to get in touch with him soon and try and get down on his waiting list. This is a stunning guitar, completely handmade of course. Massive sounding thing, but has that crisp, dry gypsy tone. The strings on here are your typical gypsy jazz Argentine 11s. I think they're 11s, I'll have to check with Andrew. And the pick that I'm using is one of these vegan is probably how you say it, Big City picks. I know that Stockello Rosenberg used these for quite a time. Maybe he still does, I'm not sure. This is my favourite pick for gypsy lead playing. I believe this is about 1.8 mil, something like that, or maybe 2 mil thick. But for the gypsy rhythm guitar playing, You can use that pick, it's going to be fine of course, but I do favour something a bit chunkier like this 3mm one from Honey Picks. Of course, I'd recommend checking out Django's original recordings of this. He recorded it a handful of different times. My preference of those would be the final recording he made of it, which I'll link to in the description. But do check out some other versions as well. The Bireli Lagrene live at Vienna version from the early 2000s is incredible. It's got one of my favourite solos of his on there, full of phrases that I still remember to this day. Many years ago, circa 2008 to 2012, I played little else but gypsy jazz. I got really obsessed with this style, went right down the rabbit hole, doing everything to the letter, using all the gear that everyone uses and all that. And Bireli was a big learning curve for me. You know, I used to work out a lot of his solos and sit there transcribing them note for note and stealing ideas off him. Such an exciting player. I'm also going to link to Gonzalo, Bergara and Adrien Moignard's version of this off their amazing Classico album. I especially love the intro they put on the front of that one. So do check out those versions at the links in the description, as well as the lesson materials and my Patreon page. And do let me know down in the comments if you have any questions at all. I always aim to respond very quickly. Have fun practicing this gorgeous music, and I'll see you guys next week for something completely different.